Hi, boys and girls. This is Miss Simpson here, and welcome back to another video of our read aloud for the book, The BFG by Roald Dahl. Now, I hope you've been joining us. I really love doing these videos with you all and getting to read this story together, find out the exciting things that happen in this mysterious world of giants and queens and the adventures that they go on. Now, I really loved having the opportunity to read this book out loud to you and see your responses as you've done some of the writing assignments. I really enjoyed getting to read those. Now, we're going to continue on. There's only going to be 2 videos left, if you can believe it. We are almost done with the book. So today we're going to read the chapter called The Plan. Now, I can't wait to see what you guys decided was going to be your plan to get the giants. But now we're going to find out what they actually decide to do in the book. So we're going to jump right in and get started. The head of the army and the head of the Air Force stood at attention beside the Queen's breakfast table. Sophie was still in her seat and the BFG was still high up on his crazy perch. It took the Queen only 5 minutes to explain the situation to the military men. "I knew there was something going on, Your Majesty," the head of the army said. "For the last 10 years, we have been getting reports from nearly every country in the world that there have been people disappearing mysteriously in the night. We had one the other day from Panama." "For the Hattie's sake," cried the BFG. "And one from Wellington in New Zealand," said the head of the army. "For the booty flavor," cried the BFG. "What is he talking about?" said the head of the Air Force. "Work it out for yourself," the Queen said. "What time is it? 10 a.m.? In 8 hours, those 9 bloodthirsty brutes will be galloping off to gobble up another couple of dozen unfortunate wretches. They have to be stopped. We must act fast." "We'll bomb the blighters," shouted the head of the Air Force. "We'll mow them down with machine guns," cried the head of the army. "I do not approve of murder," said the Queen. "But they are murderers themselves," cried the head of the army. "But that is no reason why we should follow their example," the Queen said. "2 wrongs do not make a right." "And 2 rights don't make a left," cried the BFG. "We must bring them back alive," the Queen said. "How?" the 2 military men said together. "They are all 50 feet high. They'd knock us down like 9 pins." "Wait!" cried the BFG. "Hold your horseflies. Keep your skirts on. I think I has the answer to the maiden's hair." "Let him speak," the Queen said. "Every afternoon," the BFG said, "all these giants is in the land of Noddy." "I can't understand a word this fella says," the head of the army snapped. "Why doesn't he speak clearly?" "He means the land of Nod," Sophie said. "It's pretty obvious." "Exactly," cried the BFG. "Every afternoon, all these 9 giants is lying on the ground snoozling away in a very deep sleep. They's is always resting like that before they's is galloping off to guzzle another helping of human beings." "Go on," they said. "So what?" "So what is you soldiers has to do is creep up to the giants while they's is still in the land of Noddy and tie their arms and legs with mighty ropes and wonking chains." "Brilliant," the Queen said. "That's all very well," said the head of the army, "but how do we get these brutes back here? We can't load 50-foot giants in a truck." "Shoot 'em on the spot, that's what I say." The BFG looked down from his lofty perch and said this time to the head of the Air Force, "Yous is having belly poppers, isn't you?" "Is he being rude?" asked the head of the Air Force. "He means helicopters," Sophie told him. "Then why doesn't he say so?" said the head of the Air Force. "But no helicopter is big enough to get a giant like that inside of it." "You do not put him inside," the BFG said. "You sling him underneath the belly of your belly popper and carry him like a torpedo." "Like a what?" said the head of the Air Force. "Like a torpedo," Sophie said. "Could you do that, Air Marshal?" the Queen asked. Well, I suppose we could, said the head of the Air Force, who admitted grudgingly. Then get cracking, the Queen said. You'll need 9 helicopters, one for each giant. Where is this place? The Air Force man said to the BFG. I presume you can pinpoint it on a map. Pinpoint, said the BFG. Map? I was never hearing these words before. Is this Air Force man bean talking slush bungle? The Air Marshal's face turned the color of a ripe plum. He was not used to being told he was talking like a slush bungle. The Queen, with her usual admirable tact and good sense, came to the rescue. BFG, she said, can you tell us more or less where Giant Country is? You guys are in for a treat. There are a lot of pictures in this chapter. No, Magister, the BFG said, not on my Nellie. Then we're jiggered, cried the Army General. This is ridiculous, cried the Air Marshal. You must not be giving up so easy, said the BFG calmly. The first titchy bobstickle you meet and you begin shouting like a biff squiggled. The Army General was not more used to being insulted than the Air Marshal. His face began to swell with the fury, and his cheekbones blew out until they looked like 2 huge ripe tomatoes. Your Majesty, he cried, we are dealing with a lunatic. I want nothing more to do with this ridiculous operation. The Queen, who was used to tantrums of her senior officials, ignored him completely. BFG, she said, would you please tell these rather dim-witted characters exactly what to do? A pleasure, Magister, the BFG said. Now listen to me carefully, you 2 boot-bogglers. The military men began to twitch, but they stayed put. Eyes is not having the foggiest idea where Giant Country is in the world, the BFG said. But I is always able to gallop there. Eyes is galloping forwards and backwards from Giant Country every night to blow my dreams into little Chidler's bedrooms. I is knowing the way very well. So all you have to do is this. Put your 9 big belly hoppers in the air and let them follow me as Eyes is galloping along. How long will this journey take? The Queen asked. If Wheeze is leaving now, the BFG said, we will be arriving just as the Giants is having their afternoon snozzle. Splendid, the Queen said. Turning to 2 military men, she said, prepare to leave immediately. The head of the army, who was feeling pretty miffed by the whole business, said, that's all very well, Your Majesty. But what are we going to do with these blighters once we've got them back? Don't you worry about that, the Queen told him. We'll be ready for them. Hurry up now, off you go. If it pleases Your Majesty, Sophie said, I should like to ride with the BFG to keep him company. Where will you sit? Asked the Queen. In his ear, Sophie said. Show them, BFG. The BFG got down from his high chair. He picked Sophie up with his fingers. He swiveled his huge right ear until it was parallel with the ground. Then he placed Sophie gently inside of it. The heads of the Army and the Air Force stood there goggling. The Queen smiled. You really are rather a wonderful giant, the Queen smiled. Magister, the BFG said, I was wishing to ask a very special thing of you. What is it? The Queen said. Could I please bring back in here, in the belly poppers, all my collections of dreams? These has taken me years and years to collect, and I is not wanting to lose them. Why, of course, the Queen said. I wish you a safe journey. The BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from Giant Country over the years, but he had never in his life made one quite like this. With 9 huge helicopters roaring along just over his head, he never before had traveled in broad daylight either. He had never dared to. But this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England herself, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth was going on. So there's all the helicopters. Can you spot the BFG? That's right. Down here. Looks very small compared to all those helicopters, huh? They had never seen the likes of this before. Then they never would again. Every now and then, the pilots of the helicopters would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses, crouching in the giant's right ear and waving to them. They always waved back. The pilots marveled at the giant's speed and the way he leapt across wide rivers and over huge houses. But they hadn't seen anything yet. Be careful to hang on tight, the BFG said. Weeze's going fast as a fizzlecrump. And the BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forward as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. He went skimming over the earth like some magical hop, skip, and jumper, and with his feet hardly ever touching the ground. As usual, Sophie had to crouch low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realized they were being left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened their throttles to full speed, and even then they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a world atlas on his knees and kept staring first at the atlas, then at the ground below, trying to figure out where they were going. Frantically, he turned the pages of the atlas. "Where the devil are we going?" he said. "I haven't the foggiest idea," the pilot answered. "The Queen's orders were to follow the giant, and that's exactly what I'm doing." The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy mustache. He was very proud of his mustache. He was also quite fearless, and he loved adventure. He thought this was a super adventure. "It's fun going new places," he said. "New places?" shouted the head of the Air Force. "What in the blazes do you mean, new places?" "The place we're flying over now isn't in the atlas, is it?" the pilot said, grinning. "You're darn right it isn't in the atlas," cried the head of the Air Force. "We've flown clear over the last page." "I expect that old giant knows where he's going," the young pilot said. "He's leading us into disaster," cried the head of the Air Force. He was shaking with fear. In the seat beside him sat the head of the army, who was even more terrified. "You don't mean to tell me we've gone right out of the atlas," he cried, leaning forward to look. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," cried the head of the Air Force. "Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flaming atlas. We went over that an hour ago." He turned the page. In all atlases, there were 2 completely blank pages at the very end. "So now we must be somewhere here," he said, putting a finger on one of the blank pages. "Where's here?" cried the head of the army. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, "That's why they always put 2 blank pages at the end of an atlas. They're for new countries. You're meant to fill them in yourself." The head of the Air Force glanced at the ground below. "Just look at this godforsaken desert," he cried. "All the trees are dead and the rocks are blue." "The giant has stopped," the young pilot said. "He's waving us down." The pilots throttled back their engines and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, one from each helicopter, was driven down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of very thick ropes and heavy chains. "I don't see any giants," the head of the army said. "The giant is just out of sight over there," the BFG told him. "But if yous has taken these slosh-bunking, noisy belly poppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once, and then pop goes the weasel." "So you want us to proceed by jeep?" the head of the army said. "Yes," the BFG said, "but you must all be very, very hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery-jokery." The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward, and the jeeps followed him closely behind. Suddenly, the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the army went pea-green in the face. "Those are guns," he cried. "There is a battle raging somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, the lot of you. Let's get out of here." Pig spiffle, cried the BFG. Those noises are not guns. Of course they're guns, shouted the head of the army. I am a military man, and I know the sound of a gun when I hear one. Turn back now. Those is just the giants snortling in their sleep, the BFG said. I is a giant myself, and I know a giant snortle when I is hearing one. Are you quite sure? An army man said anxiously. Positive, the BFG said. Proceed cautiously, the army man ordered, and they all moved in. Then they saw them. Even at a distance, they were big enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw what the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50-foot-long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep, and the sound of their snortling was indeed like gunfire in battle. The BFG raised his hand, and all the jeeps stopped. The soldiers got out. There's all the giants. You could see the BFG holding his hand. What happens if one of them wakes up? Whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together from fear. If any one of them is waking up, he will gobble you down before you can say Jack, Jiff. The BFG answered, grinning hugely. Me is the only one that won't be gobbled up because giants is never eating other giants. Me and Sophie is the only safe ones because Eyes is hiding her if that happens. The head of the army took several paces into the rear, and so did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back into their jeep, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary. Go forward, men, the head of the army said. Go forward and do your duty bravely. The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains. All of them were trembling mightily. No one dared speak a word. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood nearby watching the whole operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant. And within 10 minutes, 8 of the 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens and were still snoring contently. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked underneath his enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump eater began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh lump eater opened his tiny, piggy black eyes. Which of you foul pesters is wiggling my arm? He bellowed. Is that you, you rotsome manhugger? And suddenly he saw the soldiers. In a flash, he was sitting up. He looked around him. He saw more soldiers, and with a roar, he leapt to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons with them, and the head of the army put his jeep into reverse. Human beings, the flesh lump eater yelled. What is all you flush-bunking, rotsome, half-baked beans doing in our country? He made a grab at the soldier and swiped him up with his hand. Eyes is having an early supper today, he shouted, holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, watched and horror-struck. Do something, she cried. Put that human being down, the BFG shouted. The flesh lump eater turned and stared at the BFG. What is you doing here with all these grotty twiglets, he bellowed. Yous is making me very suspicious. The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump eater, but the colossal 54-foot giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. At the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG's palm and onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. She remembered the sapphire brooch the queen had pinned to her chest. Quickly, she undid it. Eyes is guzzling you nice and slow, the flesh lump eater was saying to the soldier in his hand. And then Eyes is guzzling 10 or 20 more of you midgety little maggots down there. Yous is not getting away from me because Eyes is galloping 50 times faster than you. Sophie ran behind the flesh lump eater. She was holding the brooch between her fingers. When she saw she was right up close to the great naked hairy legs, she rammed the 3-inch long pin of her brooch as hard as she could into the flesh lump eater's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh lump eater was, saw his chance. "Yous is bitten by a snake," he shouted. "I seed it biting you. It was a frightsome poisonous viper. It's a dreadly dangerous windscreen viper." "Save our souls," bellowed the flesh lump eater. "Sound the crumpets. Eyes is bitten by a septious venomsome windscreen viper." He flopped on the ground and sat there howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch. "The teeth of the deadly viper is still sticking into me," he yelled. "Eyes is feeling the teeth sinking into my ankle." The BFG saw his second chance. "We must be getting those viper's teeth out at once," he cried. "Otherwise, Yous is deader than duck soup. Eyes is helping you." The BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump eater. "You must grab your anklet very tight with both hands," he ordered. "That will stop the poisonous juices from the venomsome viper going up your leg and into your heart." The flesh lump eater grabbed his ankle with both hands. "Now close your eyes and grittle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers while Eyes is taking out the teeth of the venomsome viper," the BFG said. The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signaled for some rope. As a soldier rushed it over to him with both the flesh lump eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and hands together with one tight knot. "Eyes is pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth," the BFG said as he pulled the knot tighter. "Do it quickly," shouted the flesh lump eater, "before Eyes is pizened to death." "There he is," the BFG said, standing up. "You can look now." When the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that even the heavens trembled. He rolled and he wriggled and he fought, and he biggled and he squirmed and he squiggled. But there was not a thing he could do. "Well done, you," cried Sophie. "Well done, you," said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. "Yous is saving all our lives." "Will you please get that brooch back for me?" Sophie said. "It belongs to the queen." The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle, and the flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had even woken up during this schmizzle. When Yous is the only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, Yous is sleeping extra doubly deep, the BFG explained. The head of the army and the head of the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. "Her Majesty will be very pleased with me," the head of the army said. "I shall probably get a medal." "What's the next move?" "Now you is all driving over to my cave to load up my bottle of dreams," the BFG said. "We can't waste time with that rubbish," the army general said. "It's the queen order," Sophie said. She was now back in the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across to the BFG's cave and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, more than 5,000 to each jeep, and it took over an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountain on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. "What's that you've got in there?" the head of the army demanded to know. Curiosity is killing a rat, the BFG said as he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded to the jeeps, the BFG said, "Now we is driving back to the belly poppers and picking up the frightsome giants." The jeeps drove back to the helicopters, and the 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed up back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were laying. It was a fine sight to see them. The great air machines hovering over the trussed up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by terrific thundering of engines roaring overhead. And the finest sight of all was to observe these 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting above the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from the ropes and chains. "Eyes is flush bungled," roared the flesh lump eater. "Eyes is spits wiggled," yelled the child chewer. "Eyes is swogs swallowed," bellowed the bone cruncher. "Eyes is goose gruggled," howled the man hugger. "Eyes is gunzel swiped," shouted the meat dripper. "Eyes is flunk gungled," screamed the maid masher. "Eyes is slop groggled," squawked the gizzard gulper. "Eyes is crock squinkled," yelled the blood bottler. "Eyes is bot muggered," screeched the butcher boy. The 9 giant carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel hawsers with hooks at the end of them were lowered from the front and the rear of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giant's chains, one near the legs and the other near the arms, and then very slowly the giants were winched up into the air parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle, those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned out by the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them on the galloping giant so that they could keep him in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. And that is the end of our chapter. Exciting, isn't it? My goodness, they got them. I'm very curious to see how your guys' plans matched what actually happened with them. I think that using the helicopters was a great idea because otherwise, how are you going to get 50-foot giants across miles and miles and thousands of miles, I'm sure, get them back to England? So now your question for today, and this is going to be our last question, as next time the book kind of wraps up together. Here's what I'd like you to think about. Now our main character Sophie, now she's an orphan, so that means that she doesn't have parents. So now they've gone through this whole adventure. What would you want to do if you were Sophie? Would you want to go back to the orphanage? Would you want to stay with the giant? Would you want to try to work something out with the queen? What would you want to do if you were Sophie in this situation? So not just in general, not just for everything, but if you were in this situation where you just helped save the world, what would you want to do with your life? I'm curious to see what you guys have to think. I am so excited and so very thankful that you decided to join us during the reading of this book. And I hope you join us next time as we finish reading the BFG by Roald Dahl. I hope you've enjoyed joining us today, and I look forward to having you join us next time. Thank you.